Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, June 10th, 2022. Inflation is up again, rising in May to 8.6% compared to a year earlier, a new 40-year high, according to today's Labor Department report. We'll hear from President Joe Biden visiting the Port of Los Angeles, talking about the economy. President also finishing up the Summit of the Americas in L.A. with a statement, among other nations' leaders, on migration. We'll talk about the summit, what it accomplished, where it might have fallen short, with a USA Today White House reporter. The first public hearing of the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol is in the books. We'll hear reaction from Democrats and Republicans about what was learned at Thursday night's hearing and what to expect in the hearings still to come. Plus the latest on Russia's war in Ukraine, the military perspective from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and the humanitarian crisis from Chef Jose Andres of the World Central Kitchen, which has been providing relief in Ukraine since the invasion 3 months ago. We begin with the economy. The Associated Press writing the cost of gas, food, and most other goods and services jumped in May, pushing inflation to a 4-decade high and offering Americans no respite. Consumer prices surged 8.6% last month from a year earlier, faster than April's year-over-year increase of 8.3%, the Labor Department said Friday. The new inflation figure, the biggest increase since December 1981, heightens pressure on the Federal Reserve to continue raising interest rates aggressively, reporting from the Associated Press. President Joe Biden speaking about the report during a visit today to the Port of Los Angeles.
I understand inflation is a real challenge to American families. Today's inflation report confirmed what Americans already know. Putin's price hike is hitting America hard. Gas prices at the pump, energy and food prices account for half of the monthly price increases since May. Inflation outside of energy and food, what the economists call core inflation, moderated the last 2 months. Not enough, but it moderated. It's come down. We need it to come down much more quickly. My administration is going to continue everything we can to lower the prices to the American people, and the Congress has to act, and they have been of late. One of the key ways to fight inflation is by lowering the cost of moving goods through the supply chain. When I first started talking about the supply chain, when I came here well over a year ago, the American people understandably wondered, supply chain, well, I mean, that's not a usual part of their jargon every day. But they understand it fully now. They understand it. If you can't get the material needed to build a product you're building, whether it's an automobile or whatever it is, it makes it difficult to be able to move. And that's called the supply chain. That's why I've been focused on ports. Last fall, ports around the world were congested due to disruptions caused by the pandemic. So we brought together port operators, shipping companies, and labor, and to ease the bottlenecks. And as a result, over the holidays last, 97% of all the packages were delivered on time and on shelves when you went Christmas shopping. Remember, we weren't going to have anything on those shelves. You all did it. No, not a joke. You did it. On time with minimal delays. Delivery times are actually quicker than they were before the pandemic. And today, there are about 40% fewer containers clogging the docks for long periods of time than there were last November.
President Biden at the Port of Los Angeles. His full speech covering a number of issues: gas prices, prescription drug costs, taxes. You can find it in full at our website, cspan.org. More from the Associated Press story on the Labor Department's inflation report from May. Friday's report underscored fears that inflation is spreading beyond energy and goods whose prices are being driven higher by clogged supply chains and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If the Fed becomes more aggressive in combating inflation with rate hikes, it will mean higher cost loans for families and businesses and raise the risk of recession. Congressman Kevin Hern, Republican of Oklahoma, tweeting, 8.6% inflation is the highest in 4 decades. The American people simply cannot afford Biden's bad economy. He attached a few minutes of his appearance this morning before the report came out on the Fox Business Channel.
Well, first of all, the American people don't believe that inflation is only 8%. As you've said this morning on your show, everything is up double digit. Gas has doubled already. It's almost $5 a gallon nationwide. As you listed all the different commodities out there, how high they are. So the American people are feeling much higher price pressures than 8%. I suspect it'll be at 8.3 or higher as we see it today. The president's doing all these gimmicks to do things like, releasing 1 million barrels a day, oil that we put in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at $50 a barrel, and they'll have to replace them at $150 a barrel. I mean, just economic disaster after disaster. Now he's talking about removing tariffs from China. He wants to go easy on China now to bury the idea that he caused anything to do with inflation. This president and the administration have got to get spending under control. I just released the budget yesterday, the first budget that's been done this year. We did the budget last year as well in the Republican Study Committee that Chairman Jim Banks leads. And, it's the only responsible budget that we've seen in the 4 years that I've been in Congress. President Biden released one in March, early April, that never balances. It never balances. It adds some $20 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years.
Congressman Kevin Hern, Republican from Oklahoma, on Fox Business Channel. The House and Senate not in session today. Wall Street reaction to the inflation report. The Dow down 880, NASDAQ down 414, S&P down 116. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention will be lifting its requirement that all travelers test negative for COVID-19 before flying to the U.S. Various news outlets reporting this, citing a senior administration official in the Biden administration. They say the requirement will be lifted Sunday, 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time. This is Washington Today. From CBS News, the House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol unveiled testimony from top officials in the Trump administration at its high-profile prime-time hearing on Thursday, with lawmakers making the case that former President Donald Trump was at the center of a conspiracy to overturn the results of the 2020 election. C-SPAN covered the committee's hearing live, and Thursday night's hearing is available as a podcast. You can find it on our Washington Today podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts. Back to Los Angeles, President Biden talking about the hearing.
Everybody, before I begin, I want to say a few words very briefly about the January 6th hearings that were highlighted last night. The insurrection on January 6th, one of the darkest chapters in our nation's history. A brutal assault on our democracy, a brutal attack on law enforcement, some losing their lives, and we heard about it last night again. It's important to the American people to understand what truly happened and to understand that the same forces that led January 6th remain at work today. It's about our democracy itself. We have to protect our democracy. I know it sounds corny to say it. We're all raised in school. Democracy, every generation has to protect it. I have to admit to you, I never thought that it was going to be this straightforward a challenge before. The rule of law matters in democracies, and we're seeing how the battle for the soul of America has been far from won. But I know together, and I mean this, we can unite and defend this nation, Democrat and Republican, and allow no one to place a dagger at the throat of our democracy. That's what those hearings are all about. You're going to hear a lot more. I didn't get to watch them last night because I was doing other business. But I tell you what, there's a lot going on.
President Biden today in Los Angeles. There are two Republicans on the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, but both of those were appointed by the Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York chairs the House Republican Conference. She gave her view about Thursday night's hearing today on the Fox Business Channel.
Congresswoman, it's good to see you. Thanks very much for being here. What did you make of the testimonies last night?
Well, first of all, this is a partisan political witch hunt. It truly is a political circus. Look no further than the fact that they ran it during prime time hours. Maria, as you and I both know, a typical serious congressional hearing happens during the day, typically starting at 10 a.m. In addition, they hired a producer, the former president of ABC News, who is the same producer that covered up for Jeff Epstein and was called out for that. So this has been shameless. And what's important for the viewers to know is this is an illegitimate committee. There were no Republican appointed members appointed by the minority leader. That breaks over 230 years of precedence in the House. And most importantly, The American people are concerned about inflation. They're concerned about the crime crisis across this country, skyrocketing energy prices, as well as the border crisis. There's absolutely no primetime hearing that the Democrats are doing focused on that. So this is a political distraction, and it will do nothing to ensure that the Capitol is safe and secure in the future.
Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Republican from New York, the House Republican Conference chair, today on Fox Business. Thursday night's hearing included a short clip of Ivanka Trump, daughter of and former White House advisor to former President Trump, where she was asked about former Attorney General William Barr's assessment that the 2020 presidential election was not stolen. Ivanka Trump saying in the clip, "It affected my perspective. I respect Attorney General Barr, so I accepted what he said." Today, former President Donald Trump posting on his Truth Social platform, Ivanka Trump was not involved in looking at or studying election results. She had long since checked out and was, in my opinion, only trying to be respectful to Bill Barr and his position as Attorney General. In parentheses, he sucked. Some perspective from the committee chair, Congressman Benny Thompson, Democrat from Mississippi. He spoke to reporters after Thursday night's hearing about what was learned and looking ahead to the next hearing.
Public views are so entrenched on this issue on January 6th. How do you believe that this really changed how people view what happened on that day? Did you clear the very high hurdle that you had set?
Well, I think we told the story. We told the story about what occurred on January 6th. We told the story who invited the people here. We told of the other violent organizations who participated and actually scouted the Capitol while the speech was going on at the ellipse at the same time. So it's clear that there was more to what was occurring than just coming to a Stop the Steal rally. And some of what we presented tonight defines that as well as documented.
Do you expect former Trump White House officials or justice officials to testify in public here in the next in the public hearings? Rosen or Cipollone?
Well, it's our hope that they will. Obviously, we're a nation of laws. Our committee follows the law. We'll invite anyone who has information that they think is important to our committee. We gladly will accept them. Any information we presented tonight, if there's someone who would come under oath to our committee with a different opinion, we welcome it.
But they haven't agreed. Those individuals have not agreed.
Not at this point.
So
not at this point.
We have planning to testify in the next hearing Tuesday.
Well, we have a hearing Monday,
yeah.
Which will talk about some of the actions that went on with people to try to stop the election.
I'm sorry, everybody, we got a chairman doing error.
You'll know the network.
Congressman Benny Thompson, Democrat from Mississippi, chair of the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, meeting with reporters Thursday night after that hearing. The next meeting of the committee is Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern, and Chris Stirewalt, former Fox News political editor, saying today he'll be a witness at that hearing. He's now political editor at News Nation, and on News Nation, he talked about it. He said he can't talk about what he'll be talking about, though. Chris Stirewalt was fired from Fox News in January 2021 after Fox News said that Joe Biden had won Arizona in the 2020 presidential election. Stirewalt later writing an op-ed saying that supporters of Donald Trump's and those refusing to believe the election results were, quote, a tragic consequence of the informational malnourishment so badly afflicting this nation. By the way, there are actually 3 more hearings scheduled for next week of the Select Committee. Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern, then Wednesday, 10 a.m. Eastern, and Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern. All will be live on C-SPAN Radio and C-SPAN Television. Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Chief Robert Conte and the Mayor, Muriel Bowser, talking about what they thought of last night's House January 6th committee hearing. Those two were at a news conference today in Washington talking about preparations for some big events coming up this week, including the Pride Parade and anti-gun violence march.
A lot of the nation watched last night, and you mentioned the looming Supreme Court decision. Yeah. Are you making any preparations in light of the congressional hearings and the video, the J6 video that's being released, that there might be, as you say, pop-up demonstrations in reaction to that? And if I could get both you and Mayor Bowser's reaction to that video that was released last night of your officers.
Yeah, so, you know, a lot of these videos, many are kind of reruns for us because we've had the benefit of seeing our officers' body-worn camera video. So, you know, I know the mayor is no stranger to these very troubling images, and to be quite frank with you, it really caused me 4 days on the job to really relive some of those images that were taking place, assaults against our officers and so forth. But in that space, Mark, again, because we are the nation's capital, and because we know that, you know, protests can pop up at any moment, we have to stay in a posture of readiness to be able to respond to any uptick or any increase in activity in the First Amendment demonstration space that could pop up. The Metropolitan Police Department stands ready to respond.
I chose not to watch last night, Mark. We a lot of people here lived through it. Our police department, our fire department, were first responders on the scene. I remain so proud of what they did to protect people and to protect an institution that represents our democracy. So I'm proud of, I remain very proud of them, but also know how traumatizing it is for them to relive it.
Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, a Democrat, along with the Metropolitan Police Chief Robert Conti, a news conference today in Washington, D.C. According to the Nielsen rating agency, nearly 20 million people watched Thursday night's first hearing of that House Select Committee investigating January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. That's across broadcast and cable news. Preliminary figures. C-SPAN does not subscribe to that ratings company. Former President Barack Obama also referencing the January 6th attack on the Capitol in a speech today to the Copenhagen Democracy Summit in Denmark. Former President Obama emphasizing that democracy is not a given, must be fought for and defended, whether in the United States or Ukraine or countless other places around the world and throughout history.
On every continent, we are seeing democratic backsliding. On every continent, emboldened autocrats are ramping up repression. They're targeting minority groups. They're often flouting international law. Just as disturbing, within democracies, populist appeals grounded in fear and bigotry and resentment have elevated leaders who, once they're in office, have sought to systematically undermine democratic institutions and entrench themselves in power. In my own country, the forces that unleashed mob violence on our capital are still churning out misinformation and conspiracy theories. For those of us who fervently believe in the ideals of democracy, the question is, how do we respond? And if nothing else, recent events should shake us out of complacency. Now, there was a trend after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the sense that history was inevitably going to usher in a democratic world. Well, we've been reminded that democratic practice, democracy is neither inevitable nor self-executing. Most of recorded human history is a chronicle of violence and ignorance and conflict, of strong nations subjugating weak nations, of groups using tribe or race or gender or religion or some other difference to justify dominion over others, to grab land and territory and resources, sometimes to do it just because they can. Democracy, by contrast, has, for most of human history, been an anomaly. In a relatively small sliver of time, in fits and starts, through revolution, struggle, and sacrifice, democracy took hold in a few places, and then began, in fits and starts, to spread elsewhere in the globe. That expansion has helped contain some of humanity's baser instincts. But those instincts, those impulses, were never eliminated. Nor were the old structures of privilege and exploitation that they produced. So, the point is, if we want democracy to flourish, we will have to fight for it.
Former President Barack Obama at the Democracy Summit in Copenhagen. The summit is hosted by the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, a nonprofit that was founded by Anders Fogh Rasmussen, former Prime Minister of Denmark and former NATO Secretary General. Washington Today continues in a minute.
It seems that Roe v. Wade is always in the news, always a part of the political debate. It's been that way for the nearly 50 years since the Supreme Court decided the landmark abortion case. Justice Harry Blackmun wrote the opinion legalizing abortion.
Early in my years here, I came on board in June 1970, and Roe against Wade was decided in January 1973. It is a case that is controversial, that is constantly under scrutiny, and there is a question, I suppose, whether it ever will cease to be under scrutiny.
In this episode of C-SPAN's The Weekly, we look back at Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun, what he said about his legacy being forever associated with a famous opinion, and the big prediction he flat out got wrong. C-SPAN's The Weekly. Find it and follow wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. On the final day of the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, U.S. unveiling a plan designed to help nations, including the U.S. and the Western Hemisphere, deal with migration and the growing number of migrants, many seeking asylum, arriving on the borders of the United States. The plan does include hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to Venezuelan migrants and temporary family-based visas for Cubans and Haitians. President Biden speaking at the signing of a joint declaration.
Today, the leaders on this stage are joining together to make what, and it's an overused phrase in international relations and public life, to make a historic commitment, because it is a historic commitment we're about to make. 20 countries coming together to launch the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection. With this declaration, we're transforming our approach to managing migration in the Americas. Each of us is signing up to commitments that recognizes the challenges we all share and the responsibility that impacts on all of our nations. And that will take all of our nations, and this is I've learned by significant experience, going to take all of our nations working together in partnership to address this migration issue.
President Biden in Los Angeles at the Summit of the Americas. NBC News reports that this comes amid a stark increase in migrations to the U.S. There were 1.7 million encounters in the southwest land border during the 2021 fiscal year and 1.3 million in the first 7 months of the 2022 fiscal year, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection. But also immigration, writes NBC News, doesn't just affect the U.S. Over 2 million Venezuelan refugees have fled to neighboring Colombia, straining resources there. Peru is also hosting a large number of migrants from Venezuela. More from President Biden and the details of the pledge.
Los Angeles Declaration is built around 4 core pillars. First, stability and assistance, making sure communities that are welcoming refugees can afford to care for them, to educate them in their education, medical care, shelter, and job opportunities. Second, increasing pathways for legal migration throughout the region, as well as protections for refugees. Third, working together to implement a more humane and coordinated border management systems. And finally, making sure we're working together to respond to emergencies. You know, we know that safe, orderly, and legal migration is good for all our economies, but we need to halt the dangerous and unlawful ways people are migrating, in the dangerous ways. Unlawful migration is not acceptable, and we'll secure our borders, including through innovative, coordinated actions with our regional partners. Working these efforts simultaneously, though, humane policies that secure borders and support people representing groundbreaking integrated new approaches.
More on the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. We're joined by Rebecca Morin, White House reporter for USA Today. Thanks for being with us. What did the Biden administration want to accomplish from this summit, and how has it gone so far?
Yes. So going into the summit, the Biden administration really wanted to address some of the economic issues and climate change issues that are affecting the region, economic issues caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, much like what we're seeing in the United States. It's kind of impacted much of the Western Hemisphere. So that's something that they really wanted to address going into the summit. You know, economy, health, climate change is a really big one that's affecting multiple regions. We've seen hurricanes over the past couple of years hit many of the Caribbean islands, so they want to kind of figure out how can we help, you know, people there. And then a big issue is obviously migration. That is something that is touching the United States border, but also touching, you know, borders across the region, people leaving their country and going to a neighboring country. And so trying to figure out and find solutions for that. But, you know, as much as that's what the administration wanted to address, it's been kind of overshadowed with a really big boycott by several leaders of countries that we really need to have there, especially Mexico. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador decided to kind of skip out on the event, and that's something that he decided to skip out on the event because, you know, the United States decided to not invite Cuba, Nicaragua, or Venezuela to this really, you know, high-level gathering of leaders. And that has kind of set the stage of, you know, how the summit has been going. You know, yesterday we saw the Argentinian president bring that up at one of the, one of the sessions, and was very critical of the Biden administration for not inviting those three countries. So it's something that's sort of overshadowed the Biden administration's goals for the summit.
Does that mean that there won't be a joint statement dealing with migration that Mexico and other countries will be signing on to?
I wouldn't go that far. You know, Mexico still sent their foreign minister. So did Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. These countries that, you know, we have to work with to kind of help solve the root causes of migration and help, solve the migration issue at the United States border. There's still going to definitely be some sort of declaration, and not just with those countries, but with many countries in the region. And, you know, it might be a preliminary step. There will probably be, you know, more discussion in the coming months. President López Obrador is coming to, you know, Washington, D.C. next month in July, and he's going to meet with President Biden then. And so there will probably continue to be more updates in the coming months. But they for sure are going to sign what they're calling the Los Angeles Declaration of Migration and Protection. And so, you know, that's a preliminary step, and it will, you know, we will have to see what happens in the next coming months.
We're talking with Rebecca Morin from USA Today. Also, the influence of China in Latin America seems to be an overriding issue during the summit. How's President Biden been addressing that?
Yes, that is a very big issue, one that's been top of mind for, you know, the Biden administration. And that's why one of his big messages that he's underscored throughout the summit is democracy, not just democracy in terms of autocratic governments, but democracy in the region and trying to make sure it stays that way. When he first opened, in his opening remarks for the summit, he really highlighted how, not everyone always agrees on everything in the region, but that he believes that there's an assault of democracy in the world. And so he wants to, the administration is trying to figure out ways to, keep the Western Hemisphere democratic. And that's been his underlying, message is, democracy needs to, the Western Hemisphere is a democratic region. And that has been his message throughout the summit.
Rebecca Morin is White House reporter for USA Today. Find her stories at usatoday.com. And on Twitter, she's at Rebecca Morin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now to Russia's war in Ukraine. This from Al Jazeera. Ukraine's military intelligence directorate believes that Russia can continue its war for another year, warning that Kyiv is significantly outgunned on the front lines. And also, Ukraine's defense ministry says Moscow is seeking to completely destroy Ukrainian statehood as Russian forces press ahead with their offensive in the country's eastern Donbas region. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky speaking today virtually to university students in the United Kingdom. And during the question and answer period, many of the questions from students, a local TV reporter also allowed to ask a question, and he wanted to know how long can the fighting go on?
You yourself in recent days have been saying that you're losing about 100 men each day in the fighting in the eastern Donbas region. At what stage do the circumstances compel you, Mr. President, to try and settle for some kind of peace, if that's the right word, with the Russians, to give up on some of that territory that you're trying to regain or hold at the moment?
Ukraine wanted to have that before the aggression. Ukraine wanted to have that even before the war started in 2014, and we've publicly announced about this. Now, speaking about my feelings, I can give you only one answer. Feeling for some stabs or missteps. That's the feelings that should be demonstrated by those who missed with those steps. It's about the right decisions of different institutions that have to be made, and that would be able to save a lot of lives. And already we had 2 stages of the bloody history of our country. I believe if Ukraine would join NATO, there would be a fight for the independence of Ukraine, but there would be not so many losses. There could be maybe a small military conflict or provocations on the part of Russia, but I truly believe that we would be able to save a lot of lives. So it makes me sort of frustrated or angry, but that's their emotions, and I wouldn't call them a positive emotions, because Ukraine wanted to have its NATO future, but it wasn't given that. Still, NATO member nations are providing with support and assistance to Ukraine, and I'm not going to go into details on that. Everyone heard about this. Now, speaking about the first part of your question, throughout my presidentship, I clearly understand and understood that every war has to finish at the table of negotiations, and I understand that diplomacy can save lives. I understand this, but unfortunately, the president of Russian Federation doesn't understand this, and that's it. I mean, you need both parties willing to stop the war between their countries. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And look at the rhetorics that you've used. I'm not sure if that's the interpretation, but the interpretation sounded like, what are you ready to concede or to give up. I'd like to say that, well, there's this independence of our country, and there is not anything that we can concede.
Voice of the interpreter of the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, answering questions at today's virtual program with university students and others in Great Britain. A senior advisor to the Ukrainian president, writes United Press International, said military casualties against Russian forces are as high as 200 a day as Kyiv tries to hold on to key cities and start counteroffensives in other locations. This article at the Wall Street Journal, global companies have racked up more than $59 billion in losses from their Russian operations, with more financial pain to come as sanctions hit the country and sales and shutdowns continue. According to a review of public statements and security filings, almost 1,000 Western businesses have pledged to exit or cut back operations in Russia following its invasion of Ukraine, according to Yale researchers. That from Wall Street Journal. The future of sanctions against Russia and the toll it takes on everyone outside of Russia as well was the subject of a discussion today with Eric Woodhouse, Deputy Assistant U.S. Secretary of State for Counter-Threat Finance. Here's a question from Richard Morningstar with the Atlantic Council.
This morning, inflation numbers came out at 8.6%. And that further sanctions, particularly on oil and gas, could have, and in the U.S. case on oil maybe more than gas, could have a significant impact. And this is a political year. What are, without knowing that decisions haven't been made, and certainly you couldn't tell us if they have been, what are the considerations that would be taking place now in determining whether to go further, for example, on oil sanctions, further than Europe has already gone?
Well, thank you. And let me start by saying that, in any sanctions program, the aim is to maximize the intended impact on the target while mitigating and minimizing to the extent possible the impacts to ourselves and to our allies and partners. Obviously, in many situations, we can't fully mitigate or avoid spillover costs to ourselves or to allies and partners. I think the Russia program is a great example of that. I think from the beginning, we here in the United States and our allies and partners around the world, particularly in Europe, understood, I think their leaders have been clear about this, that there will be costs, that we will have to take measures and impose costs on Russia that will have spillovers into our own economies. I think what you see Europe working on now in terms of the oil ban that they recently announced, with respect to oil arriving in Europe, shipped oil arriving in Europe, shows them tackling those hard questions and willing to accept those costs over time in the interest of reducing their dependence on Russian oil and ensuring that that the flow of European money to Europe is less and less over time. So in the United States, obviously, we're in a different position. Some time ago, the president prohibited the import of Russian oil and LNG and coal, as well as a range of other products. And we were able to do that because of our energy system and the relatively less acute dependence that we have on imports of Russian energy. Europe is in a different position. I think we've seen them doing the hard work to put themselves in a position to make the decision like we've seen this week. And we applaud them for that. It's obviously, we think, the right direction to go. And we've been engaged helping them identify alternative sources and remain in close consultation with them in that process. Obviously, energy is a sensitive issue, not only in Europe, but globally. I expect that you'll see a sustained effort to find ways to reduce not only, for example, Europe's dependent on Russian oil, but the amount of revenue that's flowing to Russia from its energy sales. But that's something that we're going to have to work on over time.
Eric Woodhouse is Deputy Assistant U.S. Secretary of State for Counter-Threat Finance at a virtual program about sanctions against Russia. It was hosted by the Atlantic Council today. Russian President Vladimir Putin, according to Sky News, telling young entrepreneurs in Moscow that He's not ruling out invading other countries. He said, quote, "It's impossible, do you understand? Impossible to build a fence around a country like Russia, and we do not intend to build that fence." Internationally famous chef Jose Andres, founder of the nonprofit World Central Kitchen, which has been distributing in Ukraine about 10,000 meals per day to those affected by the war, over 40 million total hot meals in the 3 months since the invasion. Chef Andres today testifying remotely before a U.S. House Subcommittee on National Security, and was asked how providing aid to Ukrainians, particularly food aid, could be improved.
World Central Kitchen, we are with 3,970 distribution points. 3,900 distribution points. With this, I only want to say, quite frankly, very humbly, but at the same time, very proud, that we know what's going on. We know what the people need because we're talking with them every single day. So for food, what I will say is that now I'm afraid that we are going to be multiplying efforts by now more organizations finally arriving and everybody bringing food because they are doing something. And sometimes I will say that more doesn't equal better. The right amount equals better because we cannot collapse the local economies by giving too much food for free at the same time. We need to be very specific. I've been talking to mayors like in Mykolaiv that their concern was, how do we know that we are not breaking and collapsing the local economy? Well, you could argue too that those mayors need to know that their people are out of jobs and sometimes banks are not open or sometimes people don't have ATMs, so they need cash so that's what we are covering. But it's very important that the solutions and the actions don't happen. You don't make a decision today for 6 months from now, but that you in emergencies are day to day assessing the situation. So you know when the people need the help and you know when you need to start moving out.
Jose Andres, chef, activist, founder of World Central Kitchen, been operating in Ukraine, testifying today remotely to the U.S. House Oversight and Reform Subcommittee on National Security. No resolution apparently yet on getting Russia to open Ukrainian ports and allow export of badly needed grain to other countries. CNN reports by blocking Ukrainian ports, Russia is, quote, deliberately using starvation as a weapon, the German agricultural minister said on Friday. It is a particularly disgusting kind of warfare that Russia is engaged in, he told CNN's affiliate NTV during a visit to Kyiv on Friday. He went on, alternative routes cost an insane amount of money. It would be kamikaze for Ukraine to rely on Putin's word without credible, effective military guarantees that the security of Ukrainian ports and ships is assured. I would not trust Putin's word in any way. He has proven to be a notorious liar. That from CNN. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. You can get more of Washington's top stories sent to your inbox every day with C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word. Go to c-span.org/connect to sign up. Have a good night and weekend.